There's something unusual about your feet that science has been trying to understand for over 150 years. Nearly 1 in 4 people have it, yet most don't even realize they're part of this genetic mystery. But now, after surveying almost 1 million people, DNA, researchers have finally revealed where this trait actually comes from. This is the story of how your feet might be telling a genetic tale that goes back through generations of your family, a story written in bone structure and DNA sequences that scientists are only now beginning to fully understand. When you look down at your feet, you probably take for granted the arrangement of your toes. Most people have a big toe that's the longest digit on their foot, and the rest follow in a descending pattern. But for millions of people around the world, something different happens. When they glance down, they see something unexpected. Their second toe extends further than their big toe. It's a subtle variation, but it's one that has fascinated people throughout history and has recently become the subject of intense genetic research that's unlocking the secrets of human inheritance. This trait has many names. Scientists call it Morton's toe, named after American orthopedist Dudley Joy Morton, who first formally described the condition in medical literature. But if you look at classical art and ancient sculptures, you'll find it called by other names. In ancient times, particularly in Greece, this foot shape was known as the Greek foot because it was considered the height of beauty and perfection. The ancient Greeks believed this configuration represented nobility, divine favor, and physical excellence. Walk through any museum with classical Greek statuary and you'll notice this pattern repeated again and again in marble and bronze depictions of gods, goddesses, and idealized humans. The Greeks were so enamored with this foot structure that they carved it deliberately into their most important artistic works. But the story of this trait goes far deeper than art and aesthetics. It's fundamentally a story about genetics, inheritance, and the remarkable diversity of human anatomy. For over a century, scientists have been puzzled by this trait. How exactly does it get passed down? What determines whether you'll have it or not? Is it a simple genetic inheritance or something more complex? These questions frustrated geneticists and anthropologists for decades. But now, thanks to modern DNA sequencing technology and massive population studies, we finally have answers. The most groundbreaking research on this subject comes from Ancestry DNA, one of the world's largest genetic testing companies. In a study that would have been impossible just a few years ago, researchers asked a simple question to over 790,000 people. Is your second toe longer than your big toe? This massive sample size gave scientists an unprecedented amount of data to work with. They compared the responses of all these people with their genetic information and looked for patterns. What they discovered was astonishing. They identified over 930 different genetic markers that are associated with having a longer second toe. That's not just 1 or 2 genes. That's nearly 1,000 different locations in your DNA that have some influence on whether you'll inherit this trait. Now, you might be wondering what this means in practical terms. If there are 930 genetic markers, does that mean your chances of inheriting this trait are almost impossible to calculate? The answer is both yes and no. The research found that genetics explains about 13% of the variation in whether people have a longer second toe. That might sound like a small percentage, but it's actually quite significant when you understand what it means. It means that while genetics is a major factor, other things also influence whether you'll express this trait. It means this is not a simple dominant or recessive trait that follows Mendelian inheritance patterns. It's far more complicated and far more interesting. To truly understand why your second toe might be longer than your big toe, you need to understand the anatomy of your foot. Your foot is made up of several different types of bones working together to create a complex structure that allows you to walk, run, and balance. The long bones in the middle of your foot are called metatarsals. There are 5 of, but in people with Morton's toe, something different has happened. Their first metatarsal is shorter than their second metatarsal. This isn't because their second toe bones are longer. If you were to look at an X-ray of someone with a longer second toe, you'd find something surprising. The actual toe bones, called phalanges, are often about the same. Length in both the big toe and the second toe. What's different is the positioning of the metatarsal bones beneath them. Because the first metatarsal is shorter, it sits further back. This positioning causes the second toe to protrude further forward, creating the visual appearance of a longer toe. This anatomical variation is completely congenital, meaning it's present from birth. It's not something that develops over time through use or injury. It's not caused by wearing tight shoes or by how you walk or stand. This is how your feet were built in the womb, determined long before you ever took your first step. It's a structural feature that's been with you your entire life, even if you never noticed it. And according to the latest research, somewhere around 10 to 30% of all humans have this variation. Some studies suggest it's as high as 22% in certain populations, which means if you're in a room with 10 people, there's a good chance at least 2 of them have Morton's toe. The inheritance pattern of this trait is where things get really interesting from a genetic standpoint. For a long time, geneticists thought that toe-length ratio would follow a simple Mendelian inheritance pattern, where one gene was dominant and one was recessive, and the trait would show up in predictable ratios in families. But the real world never seems to follow the textbook models perfectly. When researchers started looking at families with this trait, they quickly realized something didn't add up. The inheritance pattern was far more complex than they expected. Sometimes two parents with longer second toes would have children with normal toe proportions. Sometimes parents with normal proportions would have children with longer second toes. The pattern seemed almost random. This complexity has led modern researchers to conclude that toe-length ratio is not determined by a single gene, but rather by multiple genes working together. This is called polygenic inheritance. Your parents pass down not just one gene for toe length, but dozens or perhaps hundreds of them, each with a small influence on how your feet will develop. Your mother might pass down 3 genes that contribute to a longer second toe, while your father passes down 5. These add up in complex ways, influenced by other genetic factors and possibly environmental factors as well. This is why you can't predict with certainty whether you'll inherit this trait even if both your parents have it. It's a complex genetic lottery where many different numbers are drawn, and the final result depends on how they all combine. Despite this complexity, one thing is clear from the research. If you have a longer second toe, there's a higher probability that your parents, siblings, and children will have it too. The trait runs in families. You might look at old family photos and see this pattern repeating across the generations. A grandmother with the trait passes it to her daughter, who passes it to her children. But the inheritance is not absolute. It's probabilistic. It's influenced by the specific combination of genes you inherited from each parent and how those genes interact with each other. The 23andMe genetic testing company has taken a different approach to understanding this trait. Rather than surveying 790,000 people and looking for genetic markers, they've identified and studied 35 specific locations in the DNA that influence toe-length ratio. These 35 locations are particularly important in determining whether your second toe will be longer than your big toe. By analyzing these 35 positions in a person's genome, 23andMe can make predictions about what someone's toe structure will likely be. They also consider other factors like age and sex when making their assessments, because genetics isn't the only thing that matters in determining physical traits. The historical fascination with toe length goes back much further than modern genetics. In 1864, long before DNA was even discovered, a British anthropologist named James Park Harrison became interested in the variation of toe proportions across different populations. Harrison noticed something remarkable while studying classical Roman and Greek statues. Many of these ancient artistic depictions showed a distinctive pattern. The second toe was longer than the big toe. This observation sparked his curiosity. Were the ancient artists just making this up? Did they observe this trait in actual people and decide to idealize it? Was this a real variation that they noticed in their populations? Harrison decided to investigate. He didn't just study statues and sculptures. He went to museums and examined the skeletal remains of ancient peoples. He measured the bones of skeletons that had been preserved for centuries. He even went so far as to examine the feet of Egyptian mummies, carefully measuring the toe and metatarsal bones to understand what the foot structure had actually been in life. His research revealed something fascinating. Toe-length ratios did indeed vary from population to population and from era to era. Some populations showed higher frequencies of longer second toes than others. This suggested that the trait had a genetic basis and that the frequency could shift over time in geography based on inheritance patterns. Harrison's work, conducted more than 150 years ago with no knowledge of modern genetics, actually laid the groundwork for our current understanding. He proved that this wasn't just random variation. There was a pattern to it. There was structure to it. It ran in families and through populations. Without knowing anything about DNA or genetic markers, he had identified a heritable trait. His work stood as the foundation for all the genetic research that would come later. Scientists building on his observations in the modern era could say with confidence, yes, this trait is inherited. Yes, it's passed down through families. Now we just need to figure out exactly how. When modern genetic research finally caught up with Harrison's observations, scientists discovered something else that was equally important. They found that while toe-length ratio is heritable and influenced by genetics, it doesn't follow a simple inheritance pattern. In one famous study conducted among Nigerian families, researchers examined 101 families and studied how the trait appeared in parents and their offspring. The results confirmed what many geneticists had suspected. Morton's toe could be said to be genetically linked, but its inheritance pattern does not conform to the simple dominant recessive model. Instead, it follows a far more complex pattern, likely involving multiple genes and possibly environmental factors as well. This finding had important implications. It meant that scientists couldn't develop a simple test that would say definitively whether a child would inherit this trait based on their parents' phenotypes. It meant the genetics of feet were more like the genetics of height or intelligence than the genetics of eye color. It meant that many different genes, each with small effects, were adding up and combining in complex ways to create the final result. This is called multifactorial or polygenic inheritance, and it's far more common than simple Mendelian inheritance in determining human traits. One of the most persistent myths about Morton's toe is that it indicates specific ancestry. People often say that if you have a longer second toe, you must have Greek ancestry, or you must be descended from Viking populations, or you must have Celtic roots. These claims have been repeated so often that they've taken on the status of folk wisdom, but modern genetic research has thoroughly debunked this myth. The trait appears in populations all around the world. It's found in African populations, Asian populations, European populations, and every other human group studied. It's not unique to any geographic region or ethnic group. While the ancient Greeks may have idealized this foot shape in their art, that doesn't mean that everyone with this foot shape is descended from Greece. The genetics simply don't work that way. What's particularly interesting is how different populations show different frequencies of this trait. Research has found that in some populations, like the Ainu people of Japan, a longer second toe is extraordinarily common, appearing in about 90% of the population. Meanwhile, in other populations, it's far less common. In Cleveland area Caucasian populations studied in the mid-20th century, only about 24% of people showed the trait. Among Nigerians in one study, researchers found that some ethnic groups within Nigeria had much higher frequencies of the trait than others. The Bini tribe showed higher incidence than groups like the Yoruba, Igbo, or Hausa. This variation between populations is not because of different genes, but rather because of different frequencies of the same genes in different populations due to random genetic drift and the history of human migration and settlement. These population differences are actually fascinating from an evolutionary perspective. They show us how human populations have diverged genetically over thousands of years of separation and different selection pressures. But they also remind us that genetic traits don't map neatly onto ethnic or geographic categories the way popular mythology sometimes suggests. A person with Morton's toe could be from anywhere in the world. They could have any ethnic background, any ancestry, any heritage. The trait tells you something about their genetics, but it doesn't tell you where their ancestors came from. When it comes to the health implications of having a longer second toe, the reality is more nuanced than you might expect. For most people with Morton's toe, there are no health problems at all. The trait itself is a completely normal anatomical variation. It's not a deformity. It's not a medical condition that requires treatment. It's just a different way of being built. Many people with this foot structure go through their entire lives without ever experiencing any discomfort or complications related to their toe proportions. They play sports, they run, they dance. They do everything that people with normal toe proportions do. Your body weight during the propulsive phase of gait. This is where most of the force is concentrated. But in people with Morton's toe, because the second metatarsal extends further forward, the weight gets transferred to that area instead. The second metatarsal head has to absorb more force than it was evolutionarily designed to handle, and this can lead to problems. The complications that can develop from this altered weight distribution include stress fractures, metatarsalgia, which is pain in the metatarsal region, and plantar fasciitis. Some people develop calluses on the ball of their foot. Others experience chronic pain and discomfort. But here's the important point. These complications are far from inevitable. Many people with Morton's toe never develop any of these problems. And for those who do, the solutions are straightforward. Proper footwear is usually the first line of treatment. Shoes with a wide toe box or a deep toe box can accommodate the longer second toe more comfortably. Orthotic inserts, designed specifically to redistribute pressure, can reduce the strain on the second metatarsal. In most cases, these conservative treatments are completely effective. The research on the health implications of Morton's toe is ongoing, and some of it is quite surprising. While traditionally the trait has been viewed primarily through the lens of potential problems it might cause, recent research has suggested something different. Some studies have found that people with Morton's toe, particularly athletes, might actually have certain biomechanical advantages. There's preliminary evidence suggesting that the foot structure associated with Morton's toe might be associated with superior athletic performance, particularly in sprinting. If this holds up under further investigation, it would turn the traditional narrative about this trait on its head. Instead of being a condition to manage or treat, it might actually be an asset in certain contexts. The Ancestry DNA research also made another important discovery in their massive study of 790,000 people. They looked not just at whether people had the trait, but at how frequently it appeared in different populations. the people who had done genetic testing with their company. The results showed that this trait is remarkably common globally. Nearly 1 in 4 people in their sample reported having a longer second toe than a big toe. That's roughly 25% of the sample. This makes it one of the more common anatomical variations in human populations. It's more common than many physical traits that people do notice and comment on. More people have this toe configuration than are left-handed. More people have this trait than have red hair. And yet, most people don't think about their toe proportions or realize that this variation is particularly common. The way the Ancestry DNA researchers used their massive data set was sophisticated and cutting edge. Once they had responses from 790,000 people in their genetic data, they could perform genome-wide association studies, which is what they call GWS. This involves analyzing millions of genetic variants across the entire genome and looking for statistical associations between genetic variants and the trait in question. When they did this for toe length, they identified 930 genetic markers that showed significant association with having a longer second toe. These markers represent locations in the genome where genetic variation is associated with variation in toe length. The 930 markers they identified don't all have equal effects. Some of them have large effects on toe length, while others have tiny effects. But when you add them all together, they account for about 13% of the variation in the trait. This 13% figure is important because it tells us how much of the variation between people in whether they have a longer second toe is explained by genetics. The other 87% is explained by environmental factors, developmental factors, and random chance in how genes express themselves. This means that genetics is definitely a major factor, but it's not the only factor. You inherit a genetic tendency toward this trait from your parents, but whether you ultimately express the trait depends on many other things as well. Understanding what those other factors might be is an area of ongoing research. Scientists believe that developmental factors during gestation might play a role. The particular pattern of gene expression that happens in the womb, influenced by hormones, nutrients, and other developmental signals, might affect whether you end up with this trait. Some researchers have theorized that factors like maternal health, nutrition during pregnancy, and hormone levels might influence whether the genetic predisposition to Morton's toe actually gets expressed as a visible trait. But much more research is needed to understand exactly how these factors work. One fascinating aspect of the genetic architecture of Morton's toe is that the 930 genetic markers that influence the trait are scattered across many different chromosomes. This means many different genes are involved, not just 1 or 2. Some of these genes might be involved in bone development and growth. Others might be involved in the regulation of metatarsal length. Some might influence overall foot size or skeletal development more broadly. Others might have pleiotropic effects, meaning they influence multiple traits simultaneously. The complexity is remarkable, and it's a reminder of how intricate human genetics really is. Nothing in the human body is determined by a single gene. Everything is the result of thousands of genes working in concert, influenced by development and environment. The discovery of these 930 genetic markers for Morton's toe has practical applications beyond just satisfying scientific curiosity. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA now use this genetic information to provide customers with predictions about their traits, including toe length ratio. When you take a DNA test with these companies, they can analyze your genetic variants and calculate a polygenic risk score for this trait. This score is a statistical tool that estimates the likelihood that you'll have a longer second toe based on your genetic makeup. It's not a perfect prediction because, remember, genetics only accounts for 13% of the variation. But it's a pretty good one. If your polygenic risk score is high, there's a good chance you'll have this trait. If it's low, there's a good chance you won't. This type of genetic prediction is the future of personalized genetics. As researchers identify more genetic markers for more traits, as our understanding of gene interactions improves, and as our statistical methods become more sophisticated, these predictions will become increasingly accurate. In the case of Morton's toe, the predictions are already pretty good, but researchers expect they'll get better. As more people do genetic testing and contribute their data to research studies, as better sequencing technology reveals genetic variants that are currently invisible, the number of identified markers will likely increase beyond 930, and the percentage of variation explained by genetics will likely increase beyond 13%. The story of how scientists came to understand the genetics of toe length is a perfect example of how modern genetics works. It combines old-fashioned observation, like Harrison measuring mummy feet in museums, with cutting-edge technology, like genome-wide association studies analyzing hundreds of thousands of people. It shows how scientific understanding builds over time, with each generation adding new pieces to the puzzle. It demonstrates the incredible power of large data sets in modern genetics, and it illustrates how something as seemingly trivial as toe proportions can reveal fundamental truths about how human genetics works. Looking at your own feet through this lens of genetic science is genuinely remarkable. Those proportions, that relationship between your big toe and your second toe, that's written in your DNA. It's a message from your ancestors, encoded in your genes. Every difference between your feet and someone else's feet is the result of tiny variations in hundreds of different genes. Every trait you see when you look down at your body is the result of this incredibly complex interplay between your genetic inheritance and your life experience. Understanding the genetics of something as simple as toe length helps us understand the genetics of far more complex traits as well. The research continues to evolve. Scientists are working on understanding the specific genes responsible for toe length variation. They're investigating the developmental mechanisms that determine metatarsal bone length. They're exploring whether Morton's toe has any relationship to other skeletal. The implications of this research extend far beyond understanding toe proportions. The methodology used to study Morton's toe is the same methodology applied to understand hundreds of other human traits. Researchers conduct genome-wide association studies by collecting data from hundreds of thousands of people, sequencing their DNA, and looking for genetic markers associated with traits. This approach is being used to understand the genetics of height, weight, intelligence, personality traits, and disease susceptibility. Understanding the genetics of toe length teaches us principles that apply to human genetics broadly. The discovery of 930 genetic markers for this trait reveals something important about genetic architecture. Most human traits are not controlled by one or two genes, but by thousands of genes, each with tiny effects that add up. This is called polygenic inheritance, and it fundamentally changed how we think about genetics. For decades, geneticists focused on single gene traits like. Another important aspect of this research is what it tells us about phenotypic prediction based on ancestry. People often use visible traits to infer ancestry or ethnicity, but the Morton's toe research shows why this approach is flawed. This trait appears in all populations with varying frequencies, but with so much overlap that you can't reliably predict someone's ancestry from it. This challenges the idea that ancestry can be reliably read from physical appearance and has important implications for questioning racial categories based on phenotypic traits. The research highlights the importance of large data sets in modern genetic science. This Ancestry DNA study was only possible because they had access to hundreds of thousands of people who took genetic tests and answered questions about physical traits. Most people were thinking about ancestry results and didn't expect their answers to contribute to groundbreaking research. But that's how modern genomic science works. Researchers aggregate data from millions of people and analyze it in unexpected ways. This has tremendous value for science, but raises important questions about data privacy, consent, and genetic information use. So the next time you look down at your feet, you might see them in a new light. You might think about the 150-year history of scientific investigation into this trait, starting with a British anthropologist measuring Egyptian mummies. You might consider the 790,000 people whose genetic information revealed the specific locations in your genome that influence toe proportions. You might appreciate the remarkable complexity of human genetics and how thousands of genes work together to create your individual traits. You might think about your parents and their parents and their parents going back countless generations, each of them passing down genetic information that ultimately contributed to the specific way your feet are built. Your feet are quite literally a record of your genetic history, an anatomical manuscript written in bone structure and passed down through time. And thanks to modern genetic science, we're finally starting to read that manuscript clearly and understand what it's telling us about who we are.